Hello once again, friends, neighbors, and fellow Christians, and welcome back to What the Bible Says, and to another lesson in our series where we are investigating this last days kingdom that was foretold by Moses and the prophets, that it would come in the last days. It would be a kingdom unlike any other kingdom that had ever existed. And so we've been searching and researching and studying through parallelism, the prophecies, and the prophecies of the promises that were associated with the coming of this kingdom. And again, let me say very briefly at the outset here, my thanks for all of you who are watching these videos, and it is truly humbling to see the number of views on some of these videos. And I just pray that this will be a blessing to you, that it will help you and encourage you to study the Bible, allowing the Bible to interpret itself. And again, if you're new to this series, then go right down there and punch the like button, hit the subscribe button, and the little bell there so you'll be notified of when we upload a video. And again, I thank you so much for your time and studying with us. And so we have yet another beautiful day that the Lord has blessed us, even though there's a lot of frost on the pumpkin this morning. It is a beautiful sunshiny day that we can take just a few minutes to study from the Word of God. And again, I pray that you will study these things. Don't just take my word for anything, because I'm human. I can be wrong. I have been wrong in the past. When I learn that I'm wrong, I change. And that is the attitude that all need to have. That is the attitude we must have if we have the intentions of pleasing God. When we learn that we're wrong, we have to change, because the Bible is right. God is right. It's impossible for God to lie. And so, that being said, then when we learn we're wrong on something, when we've misunderstood something, then we need to change. And so we've been studying more recently and investigating the timing of the biblical eschaton, and we've been looking and studying one of the promises associated with the coming of the kingdom, that is the resurrection. We've been studying in 1 Corinthians 15. We're down to verse 54. Where Paul said, when this corruptible puts on incorruption and the mortal puts on immortality, then, there's a timing word, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, and he quotes from Isaiah 25 and verse 8. And so we've been studying and investigating the context of the little apocalypse, Isaiah 24 through 29 there. And we've asked the question, why would Paul say that the resurrection would be the fulfillment of, and he quotes Isaiah 25:8, death is swallowed up in victory. Why would he do that? So that's what we've been studying and investigating. And so we're going to go down here and look at this again as we continue on in Isaiah chapter 26. Now, in the last lesson, we started here and by showing that when Isaiah says in that day, and we demonstrated what day he was talking about, and it was the same in that day, from which the context Paul says the saying would be fulfilled that is written, and he quotes Isaiah 25 and verse 8. And so it would be in that day. And so verse 5, we showed how this is a reiteration of what he has already said in chapter 25, verse 2 and verse 12. That Jesus quotes and applies to the fall of Jerusalem there in Luke 19. We've demonstrated that, all right, and how that is an inclusio, and this is a continuation of that. Again, the context from which Paul is quoting and saying, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. And so we're going to go on, and we've looked at how in the following verses here in Isaiah 26, how that the wicked would see things, but they would not see them. And we've explained that and demonstrated that, how that they would see events but not perceive the spiritual things which the physical things pointed to. All right, so we go on then in verse 12, and it says, Lord, thou wilt ordain peace for us. Now again, let's emphasize, let's consider who And this goes back to audience relevance. All right, context. Who is us? Is Isaiah talking to you and me today? No, he can't be, because we weren't alive then. So who is the us? Well, he is talking about Israel. And so when he says us, and we go on in the next verse, O Lord our God, other lords besides you have had dominion over us. So again, this we have to, when we study the Bible, we have to recognize time statements. We have to recognize audience relevance. So again, the us. What's Isaiah talking about? He's saying that other lords, leaders, tyrants, they've had dominion over Israel in the past. This is what he's saying. This is the us, Israel. O Lord our God, other lords besides you have had dominion over us, but by thee only will we make mention of thy name. They are dead, they shall not live. Now, we need to look at this. You need to understand what he's saying here, that he is not talking about physical death and physical life. It'd be kind of silly, wouldn't it, for us to just pick out a person, like maybe somebody famous in our past or whatever. Just we pick out a person, well, they're dead. You know, like Peter said on the day of Pentecost about David. He told the people, why he is dead and his sepulcher is with us unto this day. It'd be kind of silly, wouldn't it, for Peter to say, he is dead, he shall not live. Do you get my point? There's something else here. There's something figurative that the prophet is the language that he is using here. They, that's the other lords, the other tyrants, kings, what have you. They are dead, they shall not live. They are deceased, they shall not rise. Now here's why I say this. This is why he cannot be speaking of physical death. Yeah, they may be, some of them, maybe all of them, maybe they were physically dead. But that's not the point. That's not what he's saying. If that is what he's saying, then he's saying, well, they're physically dead, they're not going to ever be resurrected. So how would that contradict many passages in the Bible? Do you see why I'm saying that? There's another sense in which he is using this terminology here. So when we go on then, they are dead, they shall not live. They are deceased, they shall not rise. Okay, so when we look at this, they shall not rise, they will not live, they will not rise. Therefore thou hast visited and destroyed them and made all their memory to perish. So what he's saying here, again, this cannot be referring to physical death and physical life. All right? Therefore he has destroyed. They've been subjugated, put down. They have been removed from their position of power and dominion, which is what he said in verse 13. They have had dominion over us. They've been removed. They've been demoted. Other terms, synonyms that we could use. They will not rise. They will not ever be back into a position. They will never rise into a position of power to where they can have dominion over anyone again. This is the sense in which he is speaking here. Thou hast increased the nation, verse 15, O Lord, thou hast increased the nation, thou art glorified, thou hast removed it far unto the ends of the earth. Lord, in trouble have they visited thee. They poured out a prayer when thy chastening was upon them. Now watch. In verse 17, like as a woman with child that draweth near the time of her delivery is in pain, and crieth out in her pains, so have we been in thy sight, O Lord. Why would he say that? Because they've been in captivity. All right, verse 18, we have been with child, we have been in pain. That's the pains of travail that the woman goes into, contractions, I guess is what we would call it, when the time of the delivery is drawing nigh. So that's saying we have been with child, we have been in pain, we have, as it were, brought forth wind. We have not wrought any deliverance in the earth, neither have the inhabitants of the world fallen. Now, again, this is one of those constituent elements that we see in quite a number of places in this type of prophecy. For instance, in Jeremiah 30, this is referred to as the time of Jacob's trouble. And so you can read there, ask ye now, and see whether a man doth travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. And so this is a typical Hebrew phraseology that indicates fear. All right, that's the point. And so it would be the time of Jacob's trouble. All right, again, we find this time referred to in Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2, the time that would be like none other that had ever occurred since there was a nation. We find it again in Joel 2, verses 1 and 2, a day of darkness and of gloominess, a day of clouds and of thick darkness, as the morning spread upon the mountains, a great people and a strong, there hath not been ever the like, neither shall there be any more after it, even to the years of many generations. And Jesus conflates these prophecies in Matthew 24, quoting from Daniel 2, which verse 8 that I have on the screen here, that's not the verse. This verse is where Jesus says, all these are the beginnings of sorrows. And that word in the Greek it refers to birth pangs. So that ties this together with Jeremiah 30. It's the same concept, it's the same element, same constituent element, same thing we see right here in our text in Isaiah 26 and verse 18. And so in verse 19 then, thy dead men shall live, together with my dead body shall they arise. Awake and sing, ye that dwell in the dust, for thy dew is as the dew of herbs, and the earth shall cast out the dead. Now notice that he says here, like a woman with child, verse 17, we have been with child, verse 18, and he says, thy dead men shall live. Well, that sounds a whole lot like what we read in Ezekiel 37, verses 1 through 14. I'm not going to read all that text for time's sake. There it is on the screen. You can look it up in your Bible, and you can read that. This is the vision of the valley of dry bones. And Ezekiel prophesies over them as he is told to. All the bones come together. They stand up, an exceeding army. And the Lord tells him to prophesy to the wind. He does. Breath comes in them, and they live. God puts his spirit in them. All right. Again then, in Hosea chapter 6, and this is where we want to go. I want to go over there and look at Hosea 6 here before we continue on in Isaiah 26. Now notice in Hosea 6 and verse 1. Come, let us return unto the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He has smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days, now notice this. Now, again, with the idea here, he has smitten, well, we see that same thing stated by Isaiah in the next chapter. We're looking at chapter 26. It's stated in chapter 27, still in the little apocalypse, he shall cause them that come of Jacob to take root. Israel shall blossom and bud, and fill the face of the world with fruit. He has smitten him, see that? He has smitten him as he smote those that smote him. Now, we want to look at this in another version here, so it makes it a little bit easier to comprehend what he's saying. Well, let's just look at the New King James Version. Now notice verse 7. Has he struck Israel as he struck those who struck him, or Israel? Or has he been slain according to the slaughter of those who were slain by him in measure or in part? So again, this demonstrates he's not talking about physical dying, physical living. Israel, God has struck Israel in similar fashion as he has struck those who struck Israel. How did he strike those who struck Israel? They were taken out of power. They were demoted. They were brought down to the dust. Has he struck Israel in the same way? He says in measure or in part. How? By sending him away. Do you see that? God struck Israel. God smote Israel by sending them away. How did he send them away? He sent them into captivity because of their sin, which is what he says in the next verse, that they would be recovered because the iniquity would eventually be covered. But notice, you contended with it, he removes it by his rough wind in the day of the east wind. Therefore, by this the iniquity of Jacob will be covered, and this is the fruit of the taking away of his sin. Now again, we have studied in previous lessons how that Israel, the blood guilt would be purged. Well, this is the same idea right here, the same element. Therefore, by this the iniquity of Jacob will be covered, and this is all the fruit of the taking away of his sin when, now here's your time word, when he makes all the stones of the altar like chalk stones that are beaten to dust, wooden images and incense altars shall not stand. So again, we have to ask the question, when was the stones of the altar beaten into dust? Well, that was at the destruction of the temple in AD 70 from Isaiah 27. Again, in the little apocalypse, again, shown you from Isaiah 25 verse 2 and verse 12, and then again in chapter 26, verses Jesus quotes in Luke 19 and applying it to the destruction of Jerusalem. And here we have the same element, that they were smitten, but it would be covered when the temple would be removed. All right, now verse 2 of Hosea 6, after 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up that we may live in his sight. And see, here's what's interesting. Again, this is not talking about physical death and physical life and physical resurrection. The word revive us, he will revive us, is the same word that is used right here, that we may live. See, he will cause us to live. That's what he's saying. He will revive us. He will raise us up. That's resurrection, folks. He will raise us up that we may live in his sight. Now here's what's interesting. This is the verse that Paul is drawing from in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 4. Do you see that? Paul begins his discourse on the resurrection, referring to Christ, referring to the gospel that was preached, that they had accepted, and wherein they stood. And he says that Christ was buried, that he arose again the third day according to the Scriptures. How do I know Paul is citing this verse? Because this is the only verse. This is the only prophecy of a third day resurrection. So again, Paul begins his discussion of the resurrection from Hosea 6 and verse 2. And we have to keep that in mind because he closes the discussion with Hosea 13:14 that we see there in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 55. And we'll get to that and have more to say about that as we go on. So again, after 2 days, he will revive us. That's what we see. That's the same concept, the same element we see in our verse in Isaiah 26. Your dead men shall live. Together with my dead body shall they arise. Again, referring you to Ezekiel 37, again reflect upon verses 11 through 14 of that prophecy. And then again you can refer to John 5, 28 and 29, where Jesus said, "Marvel not, for the hour is coming, all that are in the graves hear his voice come forth," citing from Daniel 12 and verse 2 there. And so, referring to what Paul said in Romans 14 and verse 8, he says, "For if we live unto the Lord, and if we die unto the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's." So, again, on the third day, he will raise us up. Again, not trying to be redundant here, too bad anyway. This is the passage Paul begins his discussion with on the resurrection. And so he says then in verse 3, "Then shall we know, if we follow on to know the Lord, his going forth is prepared as the morning. He shall come unto us as the rain, as the latter and the former rain unto the earth." Now again, this is interesting, because here again is another one of those constituent elements. We find this element in Psalms 90, verses 4 through 7, which says, "For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past." Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It should, because that's the verse Peter is quoting in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse, I think it's 7 or 8, I forget the exact one, where he says 1,000 years, a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years like a day. The verse that most people take when they run out of an argument, they run to that verse and say, well, now, see there, God can't tell time. God don't count time like we do. Therefore, I can make up anything I want, and I can just make it, twist it to fit my theology. They don't say that. That's the practice. All right. But here we see this element of the latter rain. All right, in Psalms 90. "There carried them away as with a flood." There's the Noah analogy. "They are as asleep in the morning. They are like grass that grows up. In the morning it flourishes and grows up. In the evening it is cut down and withers. For we are consumed by thine anger, and by thy wrath we are troubled." Again, who's the we there, folks? That's Israel. Because David is including himself in that. We, that's Israel. We find the same element again in Isaiah 40, and this is the prophecy of the coming of John the Baptizer. We find the same element there again, and again with the grass that withers, we find that there as well. And we find that element in James 1, verses 10 and 11. "But the rich, in that he is made low, because as the flower of the grass he shall pass away. For the sun is no sooner risen with a burning heat, but it withers the grass, and the flower thereof falls, and the grace of the fashion of it perishes. And so also shall the rich man fade away in his ways." And I actually needed James chapter 5 there. I don't have that note there. It's on down in the lesson here, where he talks about the latter rain and the former rains. That's in James chapter 5. And so this element of the grass and the flower and so forth, we find that in Isaiah 40, James 1, and again in 1 Peter 1 and verse 24. And you can see the verse there on your screen. And so he goes on and says, "O Ephraim, what shall I do unto thee? O Judah, what shall I do unto thee? For your goodness is as a morning cloud, and as the early dew it goeth away. Therefore have I hewn them by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth." Now again, I told you that he's not talking about physical death and physical life. And here, this verse proves exactly what I just said. This is a figure of speech. You know, I played a chess tournament many years ago, and I aced the tournament. Why? Because I destroyed my opponents. I slew my opponents. It's a figure of speech. I didn't cause them any harm, any physical bodily harm. It's a figure of speech. That's the same idea here. I have hewn them, slain them by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth. And thy judgments are as light that goes forth. This is how that they were slain. This is how they were dead. They were going to be raised up, though. "For I desire to have mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. But they like men, have transgressed the covenant. There have they dealt treacherously against me. Do you see that? This is why that they were hewn by the prophets and slain by the words of the Lord's mouth, because they had transgressed the covenant. Well, the little apocalypse has that very element in the very first chapter there. Isaiah 24, the earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant. Hosea will go on in chapter 8 to say, set the trumpet to thy mouth. He shall come as an eagle against the house of the Lord. Isn't that an interesting analogy there? When you compare that to Matthew 24, or where the carcass is, thither will the eagles be gathered together. I mean, isn't that interesting? Again, we find this in Malachi chapter 3. Again, read the whole chapter. Read chapters 2, 3, and 4 of Malachi. But he says here, I will come near to you. Again, audience relevance. Who is the you? That is Israel. I will come near to you to judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, the adulterers, the false swearers, against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, and that turn aside the stranger from his right, and fear me not, saith the Lord of hosts. Malachi is talking about Israel, who was violating the covenant, just like Hosea was talking about Israel, who had transgressed the covenant, which is what Jeremiah 31 foretold in Jeremiah 31 and following, which Paul quotes in Hebrews chapter 8. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant. Now, when you read in Jeremiah, it says, which my covenant they break. Paul quotes it here and then goes on and says that that first covenant was ready to vanish away. And he says here, Hosea, but they like men have transgressed the covenant. There have they dealt treacherously against me. Again, in the little apocalypse in chapter 24, verse 16, from the uttermost part of the earth we have heard songs, even glory to the righteous. But I said, my leanness, woe unto me. The treacherous dealers have dealt treacherously. Yea, the treacherous dealers have dealt very treacherously. And again, because they had transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant. All right, again, refer back to Jeremiah 3, verses 6 through 14. Again, read the whole chapter, but these verses in particular, of how, notice here, he says, the Lord said unto me in the days of Josiah the king, hast thou seen that which backsliding Israel hath done? She hath gone up on every high mountain and under every green tree, and there played the harlot. And I said, after she had done all these things, turn thou unto me, but she turned not. And her treacherous sister Judah saw it. Now again, read the whole text, because you see how that they transgressed against God, how they dealt treacherously, and that is through idolatry. All right, he says, Gilead is the city of them that work iniquity and is polluted with blood. Well, again, that's what we'll go on and read in our chapter there in Isaiah 26, that the Lord cometh out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth also shall disclose her blood, and shall no more cover her slain. And again, this is what Jesus foretold in Matthew 23, that all the righteous bloodshed would come upon that generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets, etc. All right, so verse 9, and as troops of robbers wait for men, so the company of the priests murder in the way by consent, for they commit lewdness. So again, there's the shedding of innocent blood. I have seen a horrible thing in the house of Israel. There is the whoredom of Ephraim. Israel is defiled. Again, see this just states specifically in the text what I have been saying. The we, the us, and so forth is referring to Israel. And so there is whoredom, the whoredom of Ephraim. Again, refer to Jeremiah 3. But look at what we find when we go back to Deuteronomy 29. And this is where God foretold that they would do what they did, for a kind of a simple way to put it. Now again, read the whole chapter. I'm just going to pick a few verses here. The Lord will not spare him, but then the anger of the Lord and in his jealousy shall smoke against that man, that'd be the man that would break the covenant. And all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven. And the Lord shall separate him unto evil out of all the tribes of Israel, according to all the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the law, so that the generation to come of your children that shall rise up after you, and the stranger that shall come from a far land, shall say. Now, and he's going to say several things here of when they see this. They will say something when they see these things, okay? When they see the plagues of that land and the sickness which the Lord hath laid upon it, and that the whole land thereof is brimstone and salt and burning. Notice that the whole land is burning brimstone. Do you see that? That is not sown, nor beareth, nor any grass grows therein, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, when the Lord overthrew in his anger and in his wrath, even all the nations shall say. That's what he goes back to, that he said in verse 21. All the nations, your children, the generation that will come after you, when they see this, then they'll say, wherefore hath the Lord done this unto the land? What meaneth the heat of his great anger? Then men shall say, because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them forth out of the land of Egypt. That's what we said. Jeremiah 31, Hebrews 8, Paul quoting Jeremiah 31. Here it is again, same element. For they went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods whom they knew not and whom he had not given unto them. Again, that just describes and this is God foretelling what would happen. Israel would forsake God, Jehovah. They would break the covenant and they would commit idolatry, in addition to shedding all the innocent blood. All right, again in Deuteronomy 31:29, for I know, and this is Moses speaking to Israel, for I know that after my death you will utterly corrupt yourselves and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you when? In the latter days. Because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. That would be their idolatry. All right, again, there is whoredom, the whoredom of Ephraim. Israel is defiled. So when we look at Hosea 13, when Ephraim spake trembling, he exalted himself in Israel. But when he offended in Baal, he died. All right, now again, you've got to get this. You've got to see that he's not talking about physical life and death, because it says in verse 2, and now they sin more and more. Well, see, when he offended in Baal, he died. But now they sin more. How can a physically dead man or group of men continue to sin more and more? Do you see that? He died in a spiritual sense because God sent them away. And now they sin more and more and have made them molten images of their silver. And there's the idolatry. Again, he offended in Baal. That's idolatry. All right. And then we drop down again. Read the whole chapter. But we drop down to verse 13. He says, the sorrows of a travailing woman. So there you have that same element again. The sorrows of a travailing woman shall come upon him. He is an unwise son, for he should not stay long in the place of the breaking forth of children. Again, this is what we're reading in our chapter in Isaiah chapter 26, verses 17 and 18. All right, then the very next verse of Hosea, chapter 13, verse 14, I will ransom them from the power of the... Now we're going to read this in a literal version. All right, I will ransom them from the hand of Sheol. I will redeem them from death. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your ruin? Now again, this is the verse that Paul quotes in the next verse of our study in 1 Corinthians 15. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? See, he's not talking, and that's how the King James Version has blundered, has messed up what Paul said. Paul's not talking about the physical hole in the ground. He's talking about Hades. Hades and Sheol are synonymous. Sheol is Hebrew, Hades is Greek. It's the same concept, the same place, for lack of a better term. They are synonymous. Paul is quoting Hosea 13:14. I will ransom them from the hand of Sheol. All right? That is the death. And that's the context, or at least part of the context of Paul's discussion in 1 Corinthians 15 is overcoming the death. Now notice verse 11. O Judah, a harvest he has set for thee. He has set an harvest for you. Who? Judah. When? Notice the time word. When I return the captive of my people. Let's look at that in the New King James Version. O Judah, a harvest is appointed for you. When I return the captives of my people. Well, again, now you can pause the video and look all these passages up, because I'm not going to take time to read all of these. We've studied probably every one of these in previous lessons, but Matthew 13, we have Jesus explaining the parable of the wheat and the tares, saying specifically that the harvest is the end of this age. That's to Jesus. That's his age. That's not our age. That's his age that he was living in right then. Jesus said, don't say there's yet 4 months and then comes the harvest. Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes, look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest. All right, so we have this same concept in Joel 2, verse 23. And again, there's the element of the former and the latter rain that we've been looking at. We see it again in Joel 3, 13 through 16. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. And that would be when the sun and the moon would be turned to darkness, the stars would draw their shining, which Jesus quotes in Matthew 24, verse 29. Then says, this generation will not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. And then James 5, this is what I referred to earlier, that he talks about that they were to have patience till they receive the early and the latter rain. But notice that he says there, be patient therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. That is the parousia, folks. Look that word up in the original. That is the parousia. Why would James tell his audience right then, 2,000 years ago, tell them to be patient until the parousia of the Lord if the coming of the Lord is yet in our future? You see, that doesn't make any sense. Not to mention that he goes right on and says that the parousia of the Lord has drawn near, verse 8. And he says the judge is standing right at the door, verse 9. All right. Again, I told you we was going to pursue the timing a little more aggressively in these lessons, and that's what we're doing. I mean, you can't get around these lessons, at least not without going to 2 Peter 3, 7 or 8, whichever the verse is, 1,000 years is a day, something that's ambiguous, and so that you can make up your own storyline. Just take what these texts say, and even when folks do that, they cause a contradiction between scriptures, because James specifically said the parousia of the Lord hath drawn near. All right, so with the idea of the harvest, again, we see that in Revelation 14, verses 14 through 16. Pause the video and look at that. And again, we see this idea of the harvest by Paul using the harvest language of the first fruits in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 20 through 23. And then again, he uses the seed analogy when he says, some will say, how are the dead raised up? Now again, as we've studied, that's in the present tense. How are the dead being raised, and into what body are they coming? It's all present tense language. And so he says, and that which you are sowing is not that body that will be, but bear grain. So he goes into the grain analogy there, and we studied that, but we see that the harvest element, if you will, and that's what we see here in Hosea 6. And again, Paul, drawing from the context of Hosea 6 through Hosea 13 in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And so he says, a harvest, Judah, O Judah, he has set an harvest for thee, when he would return the captives. Well, again, that's another element that we have studied in previous lessons. And again, here's all these passages that you can stop the video and you can read these. Again, Jeremiah 30, read all of that chapter. And then in Amos 9, verses 11 through 15 particularly, talks about when the captives would be returned, and how that James quotes this text in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council, and is stating that that is being fulfilled right then. And again, we see this at the close of Ezekiel 39, which foretold the war of Gog and Magog. And again, we studied that. So again, take the time, look these passages up that I have on the screen here, and study these. Notice how that they are parallel, and how Jesus quotes and conflates these passages, and how Peter quotes from Joel 2:28 in Acts 2, says this is that was spoken by the prophet Joel, and it would be in that day that he would return the captives of Judah and Jerusalem. Joel 3. That Peter said this is that was spoken by Joel. Peter identified the beginning of this period of returning the captives. And again, Joel 3, 13 through 18, which we have just made mention of, put in the sickle, etc. And so, let's go back then to Isaiah 26. We've got a couple of verses left there. And so he says then, thy dead men shall live, together with my dead body shall they arise, awake and sing. Well, remember that we read in Matthew 4, the people that sat in darkness saw great light. And to them that sat in the region and the shadow of death, light is sprung up. Paul wrote to the Hebrews and said, for as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, and we've studied that text in previous lessons, he also likewise himself took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil. And now notice, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. You see, they were in the bondage of the death, because even living righteously according to the law of Moses, they could not escape Sheol, Hades, the death, because they would die physically. Their souls would still be separated from God. That is the death that Jesus came to abolish. That is, the death that is being spoken of here, foretold that it would come. Again, in Isaiah 51, Awake, awake, stand up, O Jerusalem, which hast drunk at the hand of the Lord the cup of his fury. Thou hast drunken of the dregs of the cup of trembling and wrung them out. And again, take the time to look these passages up and to, to read and study them and note the parallelism. And again, when he says that, awake and sing, ye that dwell in the dust. Well, again, compare that with Ezekiel 37, verses 11 through 13, which is the vision of the valley of dry bones, which we have referred to a couple of times already. And again, compare that with Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2. Many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. See, he's saying the same thing right here in Isaiah 26. Come, my people, enter into thy chambers and shut the doors about thee. Hide yourself, as it were, for a little moment, until the indignation be overpast. Well, again, compare this with Paul saying, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Compare this with Hebrews 10, where Paul said, and that's not the verse, it's where Paul said, and yet a very, very little while, he that shall come will come and will not tarry. That's the verse I had in mind. I notated the wrong verse there. And then compare that with Revelation 6, the souls that were under the altar. They cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, do you not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? White robes were given to every one of them. It was said unto them that they should rest for yet a little season, until their fellow servants also and their brethren should be killed as they were, and that time should be fulfilled. And he says in the last verse here, For behold, the Lord comes out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth shall disclose her blood, and shall no more cover her slain. Again, the Lord will come out of his place. We see that same element in Joel 3, verses 15 through 17, which we have just referred to, which Jesus quotes in Matthew 24:29. And then, again, considering Hebrews 12, whose voice then shook the earth, but now hath he promised, saying, Yet once more, I shake not the earth only, but also heaven. And this word, yet once more, signifies the removing of those things that are shaken, as of things that are made. Why? That those things which cannot be shaken may remain. All right? And he says, the inhabitants of the earth, he will come out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. Well, again, we see the same element back in chapter 24, where he said, the earth mourns and fades away, the world languishes and fades away, the haughty people of the earth do languish. The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant. Again, comparing that to Malachi 3, verses 1 through 5. And the earth shall disclose her blood. Again, compare that to Revelation 6, which we have just looked at, verses 9 through 11. And then Revelation 18, verse 24, when the judgment of Babylon had taken place, John writes, and in her, that's Mystery Babylon, the great harlot, in her was found the blood of the prophets and all the saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. And again, Jesus says the same thing in Matthew 23, 34 through 37, and that all these things would come upon this generation, that is Jesus' generation. And it was Jerusalem, it was Israel that was guilty of killing the prophets and stoning them, etc. And that's what he said there. All the righteous bloodshed will come upon you, from the blood of Abel to Zacharias, the son of Barachias. So Jesus identifies who Babylon is. because, again, things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. And in Babylon was found the blood of all the righteous bloodshed of all slain. Jesus said in Jerusalem it would come on them, all the righteous bloodshed on the earth of the righteous slain. And so as we wind down our study here this morning, I wanted to continue to complete Isaiah 26 there. And again, I know I've given you a lot of material, but you can go back and watch the video again. You can look these passages up in your own Bible, cross-reference them with other translations, and study, and again, allow the scriptures to interpret themselves. Allow the Bible to define its own terminology. Pay attention to and respect audience relevance and the time statements. All right? And that's how that you can more readily arrive at the truth on any given subject. And again, as we are studying now in our text, the resurrection. And so, again, I want to thank you for your time and studying with us. I pray you'll keep studying. I pray you'll keep watching our videos, that you will share these videos with your friends and encourage them to watch these videos and to study their Bibles. And so until our next lesson, I pray that God will bless you richly in your study of His Word, and you have a blessed day.